All right, good morning again, everybody. Good to see everyone. This concludes our study that we've been doing on communion, the Lord's Supper. I hope you guys have been enjoying this series as I have. And also, if you see me rubbing my hand a lot, you see I have a big fat finger. Satan stung me yesterday, and it is swollen. I woke up at 5 this morning because it's so swollen. And I'm convinced that bees are from the devil. Some people like them, but I'm not a fan. But we'll finish today our series on communion. And today what I want to talk about is the practical part of it. What do we do? I think it's really interesting, really neat, and really a blessing that we've learned the depth of communion, of the Lord's Supper. There's just so much there. And when we reduce it to just a memorial, we're missing so much depth to that. So I want to talk about, well, I guess I should preface this with this, because this is not a sermon saying that we're doing everything wrong and that we need to change and we need to get our acts together. That's not what that is. I think that we are incredibly blessed to be a part of a heritage that still celebrates communion every single week. There are very few denominations that still do that, and I think it's such a blessing that we do that and that we do it together. And across the world, every single Lord's Day, we celebrate this with other Christians. That's incredible. I think that we have held and maintained a very high view of communion, and I think that's really important. And I'm encouraged by that. And I hope that you all are too. So this is not a sermon about how we need to change everything, and that's not what this is. This is just a practical part saying, are there other things that we could be doing to really stay connected with each other and stay connected with God through the table. We know that the Christians met together. We know that they took communion weekly. We know that not only in the Bible, but we have an extra biblical source that I referenced before that I'm going to read from today, and that's the letter from Governor Pliny to Emperor Trajan, circa 110 AD. So the church had not been around for a real long time, and the Governor Pliny was writing the Emperor Trajan saying, we don't know what to do with all these Christians, they're everywhere. He actually talks about it as a contagious disease. That's the language he uses. This Christianity is contagious like a disease, and we need to know how to contain it and eradicate it. Clearly it was a problem for the Roman government, and they were intimidated and scared at the spread of Christianity. Christianity was spreading incredibly quickly, but the thing that's really cool and really important to me is that communion was such an integral part of Christianity that it's mentioned in this letter from the governor to the emperor. So I'm going to read a part of that letter, and I want you to think about this. Given the context of this, which was under Roman persecution, the Christians still met and they still ate the supper together. Would we be willing to do that today? Is it that important to us? I'm going to pull this up. It'll open up a separate link, and I'm going to read from this letter directly. This is Pliny the Younger's letter to Emperor Trajan. Again, it's about 110, 111 AD. I'm going to jump down a paragraph because he describes his methodology for torturing the Christians and getting a quote-unquote confession out of them. Here's what he says. Meanwhile, in the case of those who denounce to me as Christians, I have followed the following procedure. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I have no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserve to be punished. In other words, the Christians who they hold fast to this and they don't give it up, I believe that's punishable by death. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Soon accusations spread because of those proceedings, as usually happens, and several incidents occurred. An anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians, when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with statues of the gods, and also cursed Christ. None of which those who are really Christians can, it is said, be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged. You hear how chilling this language is. We offered incense and wine to the gods, and if these so-called Christians recited what I told them, we hear it's rumored that a true Christian won't be able to do that. We know for a fact that there were legitimate Christians who were renouncing Christianity because they were scared. How many there were, we don't really know, but we know that it was happening. They all worshipped your image. Now, let me go back up. Others named by the informer declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been, but had ceased to be, some 3 years before. Others, many years, some as much as 25 years. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to do some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When it was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. What do you think he's referring to here? It's the Lord's Supper. The Christians would get up before dawn, they would assemble together, they would sing hymns, they would dismiss, and they would come back in the evening, and they would have communion together. Even this, they affirmed, had ceased to do so after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. I therefore postponed the investigation and hastened to consult you. For the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you, especially because of the number involved. For many persons of every age, every rank, and also of both sexes are and will be endangered. For the contagion of this superstition, that's, by the way, from the word contagious. So he's saying it's contagious to people. Nobody's exempt from these Christians having influence on them. The young, the old, female, male, everybody's in danger of being infected by these Christians. He said the contagion of the superstition has spread not only to the cities but also to the villages and the farms, but it seems possible to check and cure it. It is certainly quite clear that the temples, meaning the pagan temples, which had been almost deserted, have begun to be frequented. That the established religion rites, long neglected, are being resumed, and that from everywhere sacrificial animals are coming. for which until now very few purchasers could be found. Hence it is easy to imagine what a multitude of people can be reformed if an opportunity for repentance is afforded. This is chilling to me. But it's also encouraging, because Christians knew what was at stake when they met together. They knew that this was going on throughout the Roman Empire. They knew that there was a very real, legitimate, pressing risk that if they assembled together, not only for worship, but also for the Lord's Supper in the evening, that they could be arrested, they could be tortured, and they could be called to recant and renounce their Christianity. And they still met, and Christianity spread like crazy. That's encouraging to me, and I think the thing to really note is that communion for them was not just remembering Christ. Communion was something much deeper, and I've been quoting from Hicks's book called Enter the Water, Come to the Table, and I'm going to quote a couple more things. And he talks about 4 practicalities of the table, and this is in conclusion of his book. He says, first, the table is no mere memorial. On the contrary, it is a divine act. Too often we reduce the supper to mere symbolism by either theology or practice or both. This leads to a focus on human action as if the meaning of the supper is wholly dependent upon us. In other words, how we remember, what we think about, how introspective we are, whether we do it right, etc., etc. So he's saying it's not about us. There's a real legitimate divine act that happens when we commune together and when we take the body and the blood of Christ each and every time we assemble. Second, he says the Lord's table is a communal event. It is not an individualistic act. We don't sit alone. On the contrary, we sit with the whole church, not only the ones gathered in the same assembly, but also the universal church gathered in the heavenlies. He says private moments with God are important, necessary, and wonderful, but the Lord's Supper is not one of them. This is a communal moment with God. The Lord's Supper was never a private, individualized time where we quietly sit and break bread and juice and take that to ourselves. It was a communal meal. They sat down together and they served one another. Third, the table is an experience of the future. As the kingdom meal, we eat and drink at the messianic banquet whenever we sit at the Lord's table. So it's a time where we long for whenever we sit at the table with all the Christians from within the world from the beginning of time. We all sit together at the banquet in the heavens with Christ himself. And fourth, finally, the Lord's table is an experience of grace and assurance. As Jesus said, the body is given for you, and the blood is poured out for you. The Lord's Supper is a concrete moment by which we know that we belong to Christ, to each other, and that, as the song Blessed Assurance rings out, Christ is mine. We do not approach the table of the Lord in fear and guilt, but in faith that is assured through eating and drinking. He goes on and he talks about, he gives examples of some things that churches are doing because, there's a real genuine logistical issue that because we've practiced the Lord's Supper the way that we have for so long, that to sit down and eat a meal together really isn't practical. And a lot of our churches are a lot bigger than the small churches that we find in the New Testament. And so there's a real practical issue to that. And he says, and I agree with him, the goal is not to get us to stop doing this on Sundays. We continue to eat the Lord's Supper. But he gives a couple ideas, and he says, we can start with just reimagining the Lord's Supper. And he says whether it's just in our mind or whether it's symbolically or whether we do things, he said there's something sacred about a table. We all know that. Those of us who sit down and eat with people, there's something sacred and powerful about eating with people. I remember Mike McKay used to always say, you can tell everything about a person just by sitting down at the table with them and seeing how they eat. He said, I could tell which kids were distressed when he worked at Outside In. He said, I could tell which ones had been abandoned by their parents. He said, I could tell which ones had been neglected, mistreated. He said, you can tell everything about a person just by sitting down at the table and eating with them. There's something sacred about the table. And so Hicks said, one of the cool things that some churches are doing is they're replacing the altar with an actual table. And when people take communion, they come up to the table, and it's still the bread and the juice like it is now. They're not eating a meal, but they're eating at a table. And he said there's just that communal aspect that people walking up to the table together as a body of believers is so powerful. Some other people are doing communion in their small groups in their homes. So Sunday afternoon or evening, a lot of bigger churches break into small groups, and they'll have communion both Sunday with the whole body, and then Sunday evening they'll have a meal that is a communion meal in their homes. And those are just some of several ideas that some churches are doing. I know when we were in Arkansas, we had a Sunday night communion service, and it was a service that was just all about the table. And we would have people give thoughts at communion, read Bible scriptures at communion. We would sing. We called it spontaneous singing. Anybody in the audience, there was no song leader, so anybody in the audience could just start a song and then people would just join in. There's something really cool about that. And it feels communal. And then as you felt led, whenever it was time to start taking communion, you could walk up whenever you wanted, and they had a table set up with communion, and you would walk up, and you could take friends with you, whoever you were sitting with. You could walk up with people and you would take it together. I really missed that communion service. I loved that communion service. So those are just some ideas, but I think the point of this is we shouldn't stagnate, and we shouldn't just say, well, this is the way that we've always done it, and so, why do we need to think about this stuff? This is the center of our worship. And it's a celebration. And it's awesome, and it's incredible. And I think as we go forward as a congregation and as a church worldwide, I think it's really important to re-envision the Lord's Supper and to think back to the way that they met in the first century. It's so cool. And it's so powerful. As we read the text in Acts chapter 2, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to the prayers, and I would put an insert here, even to the point of death. They devoted themselves even when they knew that they would be interrogated and persecuted. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending to the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Isn't that cool? Isn't that encouraging? The Lord's Supper is a time where we celebrate. And we think about this and we reflect on this. It's not a funeral service and it's not depressing. It's a celebration. So hopefully you guys can, this has been helpful for you to rethink and to think through communion. I love our heritage. And I love that we give so much importance and significance to the Lord's table. May we never stop doing that. If there's anybody this morning who has any prayer needs or anybody who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, we would invite you to come up, or our shepherds will be in the back as we all stand and sing together.